As long as I have been doing astrophotography, I have always sung the praises of high focal length. Yes, I know it's more challenging. It places greater demands on mount hardware and guiding software. And if there are flaws within the image, it may well be more likely to show them up because any little errors in guiding will show more, errors in seeing will show more, and even errors in processing may show up more. In the same way that if you saw a glitch in any photo, zooming in on it might make that glitch show up further. But times have changed, and shooting in high focal length is simply not as difficult as it used to be. To be honest, in the shooting conditions where I live, which is not great, it's true I do have dark skies and that's very nice. But I live in the woods of eastern Canada, where summer nights are often extremely humid and foggy, and winter nights, while they can be clear as a bell, often have poor seeing, ice high in the atmosphere and stiff breezes to contend with. Nonetheless, I find managing all these problems to be both doable and worth the challenges for the outcomes. And the hardware and software that we are working with today handles the challenges of high focal length so much better. To make this case, I present to you 5 images. 4 of them, in the center column and the Horsehead on the right, were shot in 2024, and the Great Orion Nebula in the left column I shot in the dead of winter just last week. All of these images were shot with a Celestron 203mm or 8-inch Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope, using an EQ6R mount and controlled through a U59 PC, which itself was controlled from the desktop in my lab in the cottage about 100 meters away. A 0.63 reducer was used on the SCT, reducing its 2032mm native focal length to 1280mm. This also drops the focal ratio to f6.3. Integration time for the images of the center column were between 10 and 20 hours, and in the case of the Horsehead Nebula it was nearly 30 hours. The Great Orion Nebula is a very bright DSO, however, and that image represents just over 4 hours of integration time. Finally, they were all shot in LRGB using ZWO LRGB filters. Let's take a look and see what shooting in high focal length can accomplish. We'll start with the image of IC405, the Flaming Star Nebula. Using the free planetarium software Stellarium, we'll watch IC405 come over the horizon. Let's back up to the point where it appears at about the size you would see it in the night sky were you to observe it coming over the horizon with the naked eye. Now let's get a perspective of it using a fairly low focal length telescope, say an 80mm refractor with about 450mm of focal length. You can definitely make out a lot of the nebula from this perspective, but what if we want to see the detail in the area that I'm circling? Let's change the perspective of Stellarium to that of an SCT with 2032mm native focal length, brought down to 1280mm focal length by way of a 0.63 reducer. The image quality in Stellarium does not reveal much detail, but it does help us to understand perspective. By increasing focal length, we'll get a much closer perspective of this nebula, which will reveal more small detail. To illustrate, here are the actual results of IC405 from an image I shot. By getting in very close and spending 9.5 hours on this target, a great deal of detail can be resolved. High focal length on the target reveals detail that would not appear with low focal length. It's a lot like why wildlife photographers use powerful high focal length lenses to observe wildlife in the distance. Sure, you might be able to tell there's a bird out there, a fox or a coyote or an owl or whatnot. But if you want to reveal the beauty and the magnificence of the detail, you have to get in close. But if you were to do wildlife photography using a camera with a high focal length lens, you would have to make plans to accommodate that lens. For example, you're going to need a tripod to stabilize the camera, or at least a branch to rest it on. In other words, you'll have to take extra measures to deal with camera shake, because the high focal length will magnify that. And as the animal moves around, you'll have more challenges tracking it. And I think it's no different shooting the objects that are in space. High focal length is more challenging, but it's worth it. And with that being said, I genuinely don't find it that much more difficult. Like, for example, I really don't think it's any more difficult to shoot with my high focal length SCT versus my low focal length refractor. They both plate solve and find their targets just as fast. Granted, the low focal length might be a little bit more forgiving when the mount makes guiding errors, but I don't find that there is enough difference to really worry over. Let's take a look at the Dumbbell Nebula. We'll use Stellarium again to perceive it as if it were coming over the horizon, which gives us a sense of perspective, I think. And you can see that from about the perspective of the human eye, it's remarkably tiny in the sky, barely visible at all. And if we switch to the perspective of an 80mm refractor shooting at 450mm of focal length, we get this. It's still very tiny. It's going to be hard to really find any details in that. But watch what happens when we switch to the perspective of the SCT telescope shooting at 1280mm of focal length. It now occupies a much greater area of the field of view, and the area that it occupies is information that you can build upon. And in real life, developing that information looks like this. Shooting at 1280mm of focal length and cropping in just a little made it possible to reveal much of the detailed information within the small planetary nebula. There is a hot white dwarf progenitor star at its core, and across centuries it erupts, throwing off mass that speeds away from the dying star, which can be seen in this image in the form of layers. And it is estimated that these layers expand the size of the nebula by roughly 2.6 arcseconds per century. Though as they get further from the star, they are cooled and become less visible. However, we can see remnants of that long thrown-off nebulosity in the dimmer haze around the Dumbbell Nebula. And shooting at high focal length allows us to make out fine details, such as the cups and knots in their tails, which appear as reddish, sometimes curved dashes within the primary body of the nebula. Let's take a look at another famously beautiful deep sky object, the Tadpole Nebula. From the perspective of the human eye, it's only about this big. But if we look at it through our hypothetical 80mm aperture, 450mm focal length, it appears about this big. And in that field of view, we can capture the entire nebula, but the tadpoles themselves would be infinitesimal. You could shoot them at low focal length and then crop in, but that'll make your image grainy. On the other hand, when we switch to a high focal length telescope, the tadpoles become much more substantial within the image. In fact, shooting at 1280mm of focal length, they look like this. One of the great advantages of shooting at a native high focal length rather than shooting at a low focal length and cropping in is cropping causes degradation of the image, because the more you crop, the larger the individual pixels that make up the image become, and so the grainier the image will look. But when the image is shot with a telescope that has a native high focal length, there is no cropping, hence the image does not become grainy, and thus the quality of the high frequency information, which is where detail is captured, can be maximized. Now, toward the beginning of last winter, I got it in mind to try to make one of the most detailed images of the Horsehead Nebula ever made with an amateur telescope. That project is still ongoing, but right now it's sitting at about 30 hours of integration time, and the project was focused on the Horsehead now coming over the horizon here. And if it were bright enough to be perceived with the human eye, this is about the size it would look as it came over the horizon. And if we push on to our virtual 80mm aperture telescope with its 450mm of focal length, we get a much better perspective, but the Horsehead itself is still diminutive. The only way we would really be able to extract detail from that image would be to crop in a great deal, and the more we crop, the grainier the image will become. But if you want to try to shoot a very detailed image of the Horsehead Nebula, there is a better way, and that way is focal length. And as is often the case for me, shooting through the SCT telescope with a 0.63 reducer to give 1280mm of focal length. That kind of focal length provides this close-in perspective, which can be turned into this degree of detail. Here is the same image, shot with an 81mm aperture, 450mm focal length telescope. And this is what the Horsehead looks like when one simply tries to crop in. It's not bad, but it is grainier, and the detail just isn't there. More detail could doubtless be resolved with more integration time, but even if you did give this image more integration time, cropping in so much is still going to result in graininess issues. This also means that any flaws, such as noise and any other problems within the image, will be magnified by the cropping. Ultimately, shooting at a low focal length is not a panacea. It doesn't make your images better, and it doesn't make them immune to problems. It's a trade-off. It may help some guiding challenges, but it will also conceal the detail that can only be revealed with a perspective that gets in close and personal. Now let's take a look at the last image, the Great Orion Nebula, which I shot just a week ago. In terms of illustrating the power of focal length, this image is sort of my pièce de résistance, because I shot it specifically with the goal of illuminating as much of the interior of the Great Orion Nebula as possible. And this was made possible by shooting the nebula as a 4-part mosaic. In fact, I had to shoot it as a 4-part mosaic because the Great Orion Nebula is the closest stellar nursery to Earth, and it's pretty big in the night sky, about the size of 4 full moons. and that's if we do not count the surrounding dust and gases. Now, shot at 450mm of focal length, the Great Orion Nebula looks something like this. And here's an actual image I shot of the Great Orion Nebula at 450mm focal length. The low focal length and the rectangular shape of the IMX585 camera sensor that I was using to shoot this image allowed us to get the entire Great Orion Nebula in a single shot, and even a bit of the Running Man Nebula in the upper left corner, and portray some of the surrounding gases. And we even have a fair bit of detail and good color within this image. Let's go ahead and zoom in on this low focal length image to the trapezium cluster, which is the bright white area in the center, and Demerance Nebula, which is the small sphere of pinkish red color just to the left of the trapezium, right here. I think this image portrays a fair bit of detail of the Orion Nebula, but, as you're about to see, not nearly as much and not nearly as sharp as an image that was captured using a high focal length telescope. So now, we'll switch to the image of the Great Orion Nebula that I shot just last weekend at 1280mm of focal length. Here is the entire image of the Great Orion Nebula, and I'm sure you have noticed right off the bat that even at this distant perspective, the entire nebula appears much sharper than it did in the previous low focal length image. Let's go ahead and zoom in to the same degree to the same region, the trapezium cluster and Demerance Nebula. The high focal length image is in every way far superior, and an incredible thing about it is it can zoom in much further and retain incredible sharpness and detail, portraying what is going on within the nebula much more clearly than can be perceived using the low focal length image. To illustrate further, I'll put this image side by side the low focal length image. As I'm sure you can see, the high focal length image is less grainy, much sharper, and much more detail is captured, to the point that parts of the image that only appear as a haze or a smudge in the low focal length image are greatly refined and have structure within the high focal length image. In point of fact, every aspect of the high focal length image is superior. So in conclusion, if you've been thinking about getting a high focal length telescope, I would certainly recommend it. I think you'll get the best results from a reflector telescope, especially the Schmidt-Cassegrain model, because they don't weigh all that much and they're actually quite compact, which means they don't put a lot of area sitting on top of your mount for winds to buffet around during the night. Plus, they're closed telescopes, so they're easier to keep clean than open reflector telescopes like Newtonian telescopes. They can be a bit bad for collecting dew during the night, but I found that's not difficult to manage, and I absolutely never have problems with dew collecting on the telescope. And summer nights where I live easily approach 100% humidity. If you're curious about how to keep dew off of SCTs, look at my video, 3 stages to keep a SCT dew-free. But you don't have to get an SCT. There are plenty of other good options out there. Whatever works for you is fine. I just recommend getting into the world of high focal length. It will open up a whole new perspective on the wonders of the sky overhead. Thank you for watching, and if you have any thoughts, observations, or comments, please leave them in the comment section below. I hope everybody is keeping their heads together through this presently trying time, and I hope we see the world come through this better than it was when it began. Things only get better when we remember we're all human. We're all in this life together, and life is best when we all do our part to make life better for each other. Now have a blast getting out there and shooting that marvelous sky.